The cold hit them first. Not the kind that stiffens fingers or chills bone. This was something deeper, something alive. A cold that seemed to reach inside the body, coil around the heart, and squeeze until breath came out in white, desperate bursts. The men of the 31st Regimental Combat Team stepped off the trucks and felt it instantly. Chosin Reservoir wasn't just a place, it was a warning. Snow drifted sideways in the wind, carried in thin, vicious sheets across the frozen valley. The landscape looked dead. White ridges, black pines, silent hills stretching endlessly, all of it illuminated by a pale sun that offered no warmth. To the men marching north, it felt like they were crossing into another world entirely. Lieutenant Andrews pulled his parka tighter as he walked along the column. "Keep moving," he called, though each word turned brittle in the air. "We reach our positions before nightfall." Nightfall. The men exchanged uneasy glances. They'd already heard the rumors. Temperatures dropping to -30, rifles freezing, canteens turning to ice before a man could drink. There were stories about frostbite creeping up fingers like a silent thief, about soldiers losing feeling in their feet without realizing it until it was too late. But orders were orders. They were to move along the eastern shore of the reservoir, hold the road, and support the push north. Intelligence said the Chinese weren't in the area. Maybe a few scouts, maybe a small screening force, nothing major. Still, Andrews couldn't shake the feeling gnawing at him. The silence was wrong, the emptiness too absolute. Even war had rhythm, the distant echo of artillery, the murmur of engines, the human hum of movement. Here there was nothing but wind. Private Connolly trudged beside him, breath crystallizing at his lips. "Sir, why's it so quiet? Feels like the whole valley's listening." Andrews didn't answer. He didn't have to. The men already sensed it. Ahead, the convoy slowed as the lead jeeps reached the crest of a narrow ridge. Below lay the reservoir, a vast sheet of ice stretching into the distance, shimmering faintly under the weak winter light. Beyond it, mountains rose like dark teeth against the sky. Some of the younger soldiers paused to take in the view. Most just tightened their coats, wishing they were anywhere else. Captain Marshall rode up on a tracked carrier and brought the column to a halt. "We dig in here for now," he announced. "Perimeter positions along the road. Set your fires low. We don't want to advertise." The men began to unload gear, boots crunching in the ice-encrusted snow. Engineers chopped shallow foxholes into the frozen ground, each strike of the entrenching tool ricocheting with a metallic ring. Machine gun teams set up along the ridgelines, their breath-forming clouds around the barrels. Andrews scanned the horizon through binoculars. Nothing moved. No figures, no trails, no campfires. Just endless white stretching into cold infinity. Then, faintly, he heard it. A sound carried by the wind. A distant rumble. Not engines, not artillery. Footsteps, many of them. He lowered the binoculars slowly, heart tightening. "Marshal," he said, voice low, "did Intel mention any large Chinese formations near here?" "None," Marshall replied. "They're supposed to be miles west." Andrews looked again toward the distant ridges. Snow swirled across them in steady waves, hiding whatever lay beyond. He didn't see anyone, but he felt them. Thousands, moving, watching. The cold deepened, as if the valley itself braced for something approaching. Connolly stepped beside him. "Sir, you think we're alone out here?" Andrews exhaled a long, frosted breath. "No," he said softly. "I don't think we're alone at all." Night would fall soon, and whatever was out there, whatever was coming, would use the darkness as its ally. The men didn't know it yet, but they hadn't marched into a support position. They had marched into a trap. The kind only the frozen wilderness could hold, and only the desperate could escape. Darkness returned to the reservoir with a speed that felt unnatural, swallowing the valley as if someone had doused the sun. The cold sharpened instantly. Breath froze on collars. Frost webbed across rifle stocks. Even the wind seemed to howl differently, deeper, heavier, as though carrying a warning buried in its voice. The men of the 31st RCT huddled in their shallow, ice-bitten foxholes as lanterns dimmed under cloth covers. Fires were forbidden. Cigarettes had to be cupped tightly. Any light, they were told, could be seen for miles in this white echo chamber of mountains. Andrews moved through the perimeter with slow, heavy steps. Snow crunched beneath his boots like shattered glass. "Check your bolts," he whispered to each position. "Make sure your oil hasn't frozen." Most men already knew. They had learned painfully fast that metal behaved differently here. Rifle action stiffened. Triggers resisted. A man's fingers could numb in seconds when exposed. Private Connolly rubbed his hands together, breath shivering in front of him. "Sir, what did you hear earlier?" Andrews didn't want to say it aloud. Not yet. Not until he knew more. "Movement," he answered quietly. "Far off. Could be echoes. Could be nothing." But the tension in his voice betrayed him. Just after midnight, a flare arced high above the western ridge, not American and not a signal they recognized. It glowed red as it floated downward, lighting the snow in ghostly hues. Men stirred nervously. Machine gun crews braced. Officers scanned sectors with binoculars that instantly fogged. Captain Marshall joined Andrews at the command post. "Chinese?" he whispered. "Has to be," Andrews replied. "Nobody else is out here." "But Intel said—" "I know what Intel said." His voice was low, steady. "I also know what I heard." As if summoned by his words, the silence broke. A low rumbling chorus echoed from the mountains. Not mechanical, not thunder. Voices, human voices. A sound rolling across the frozen terrain like a tide. Connolly stiffened. "Sir, that's chanting." Andrews nodded, his skin tightening despite the cold. The Chinese often used coordinated shouting and banging to disorient enemy troops before an attack. But this wasn't shouting. It was more like a march of hundreds, maybe thousands, and it was getting closer. Marshall leaned forward, straining to hear through the wind. "Positions," he ordered softly. "Wake every man, load belts, check barrels." The perimeter came alive with controlled, quiet movements. The click of magazines, the soft scrape of boots, the whisper of rifles being braced on snowbanks. Then the chanting stopped. Instantly, completely. The valley fell silent again, the kind of silence that presses against the eardrums. Andrews scanned the white blur below. Nothing moved. No shapes, no shadows. But something was out there. The first sign appeared on the southern ridge, faint glimmers of light, moving in a slow, horizontal line. At first he thought it was another flare, until he realized the pattern wasn't rising or falling. It was advancing. "Lanterns," Dawson murmured behind him. "They're using lanterns." One by one, more lights appeared, spreading left and right until a long, wavering chain of dim orange dots stretched across the valley. They looked like fireflies drifting in slow formation, too many to count. Andrews felt the cold twist deeper in his gut. This wasn't a patrol. This wasn't a probing force. This was an army. A wind gust swept across the reservoir, carrying a single, unmistakable sound. Boots, marching in snow. Thousands of them. "Sir," Connolly whispered, voice thin. "They're everywhere." Andrews lowered his binoculars, jaw tightening. "Get ready," he said quietly. "Tonight the mountains aren't quiet anymore." From somewhere in the darkness came a sharp whistle, a signal. The lanterns disappeared all at once, snuffed out like stars behind a cloud. The valley went black. The cold deepened, and the night finally moved. For several long seconds, nothing moved. No lanterns, no shadows. No sounds except the wind sliding across the frozen reservoir. The sudden darkness after the chain of lights felt unnatural, like the mountains themselves had inhaled and were holding their breath. Every Marine on the line sensed it, the stillness before impact, the moment when instinct screamed louder than orders. Andrews crouched beside a snowbank, scanning the valley below. His breath plumed in slow, strained clouds. "Stay low," he whispered. "Eyes forward. They're coming. We just don't know from where." Connolly tightened his gloves, holding his rifle closer to his chest to preserve warmth. "Sir, if they're out there, why aren't they attacking?" "They're positioning," Andrews murmured. "They want to hit us all at once." A faint crunch echoed from the far left flank, then another, then dozens more, uneven, scattered, but coordinated. Someone whispered, "Movement. Everywhere." Dawson, manning a frozen machine gun, leaned into his sights. "Sir, I've got shapes. Can't tell how many." Before Andrews could respond, a piercing whistle cut through the air, shrill and sharp, bouncing across the frozen valley like a blade. Then the mountains roared. Gunfire erupted from 3 directions at once, muzzle flashes sparking in the dark, bullets cracking through the icy air. The Chinese had opened up with sudden, overwhelming intensity. Rifles, light machine guns, mortars thumping somewhere deeper in the hills. The first rounds tore into the perimeter, shredding branches, slamming into snowbanks, sending frozen shrapnel flying. "Down! Everyone down!" Andrews shouted. Marines flattened themselves behind whatever cover existed. A rock, a tree trunk, the lip of a shallow foxhole barely scraped into the ice. Dawson squeezed the machine gun's trigger. Nothing. The bolt refused to budge. "Gun's frozen!" "Clear it!" Andrews barked, firing a short-controlled burst toward flickering muzzle flashes. His rounds disappeared into the dark, but the act of firing steadied the men, reminded them they weren't helpless. More flashes lit the valley. The Chinese were advancing, not in a wild rush, but in disciplined waves, using the frozen terrain with precision. Silhouettes darted between ridges, dropping to a knee, firing, moving again. Their coordination was perfect, their timing exact. Connolly's breath shook as he fired. "Sir, they're pushing the right." "They're pushing everywhere," Andrews replied. Snow exploded beside him as a mortar landed short. The shockwave rolled across the ridge, knocking men into the ice. Ears rang. Fog mixed with powder as the night turned chaotic. "Left flank! They're climbing!" someone yelled. Andrews turned in time to see shapes closing in through the swirling snow, dark figures moving low and fast. "Hold your fire until they're close!" he shouted. "Conserve ammo!" The Marines did as ordered, waiting until the silhouettes grew solid enough to identify. Then the ridge erupted with controlled bursts of fire, the muzzle flashes briefly revealing dozens of figures pressing upward. The first wave recoiled, but the pressure didn't stop. New shadows replaced the fallen. More movement surged from the rear. The Chinese weren't testing the line anymore. They were trying to break it. Dawson finally slammed the machine gun's bolt free, a chunk of ice snapping loose. He squeezed the trigger, the barrel spit fire into the dark, sweeping across the slope. The advance faltered. Several silhouettes dropped or scattered. "Keep it up," Andrews shouted. But the gun coughed, sputtered, and jammed again. Dawson slammed a fist against the receiver. "This cold is killing us." Another mortar burst rocked the ridge. Snow and debris rained down. A tree splintered nearby, its trunk cracking like a bone snapping. The Marines huddled closer, their perimeter tightening with each passing minute. They were being squeezed, not quickly but deliberately, like a vice grinding inward. "We can't hold if they keep hitting all sides," Connolly yelled over the gunfire. "We're not letting them through," Andrews replied fiercely. But he felt the truth clawing at him. This wasn't a probing attack. This wasn't intimidation. This was the opening blow of an encirclement. Through the chaos, Andrews raised his eyes toward the northern ridge. Shadows were massing there too, waiting, preparing. The real assault hadn't begun, not yet, and when it did, the ridge might not survive it. The gunfire tapered off as abruptly as it had begun, fading into the vast frozen silence that wrapped itself around Chosin Reservoir like a shroud. The mountains swallowed the last echoes, leaving only the ragged breathing of men lying pressed into the snow. Steam rose from their rifles, frost clung to their sleeves, every heartbeat felt amplified in the cold. Andrews lifted his head cautiously. The valley below was dark again, no muzzle flashes, no movement, no silhouettes moving between the ridges. The Chinese had vanished. Connolly whispered, "Sir, where'd they go?" "Nowhere," Andrews answered. "They're still here. They're just waiting." The men exchanged uneasy glances. Fighting an enemy you could see was one thing. Fighting one who disappeared into snow and shadows was something else entirely, something far more unnerving. Dawson slammed his palm against the machine gun again, cursing under his breath. "Frozen solid now. I can't break it loose." Andrews knelt beside him. The receiver was rimed with a layer of ice thick as glass. "Wrap it. Warm it under your coat if you have to. We'll need it before this night is over." Dawson nodded reluctantly, tucking the icy weapon against his chest like a wounded limb. A cold gust swept across the ridge, carrying with it a faint, distant noise. Not shouting, not gunfire. Something softer, crunching snow, steady, rhythmic. Connolly stiffened. "They're moving again." Andrews raised a hand. "Hold." No one fired. No one spoke. But the sound was unmistakable. Boots advancing through snow, dozens at least, maybe hundreds. The noise drifted from the southern ridge, then shifted to the east, then the west, circling them like a pack testing the edge of a wounded animal. "They're surrounding us," Dawson murmured. "Not yet," Andrews replied, "but they're setting the noose." The radio operator crawled over, cradling the frosted handset. "Sir, I'm getting fragments from HQ, just static and bursts. They're trying to call us, but something's blocking the signal." "Terrain," Connolly asked. "Or someone jamming us," Andrews said grimly. The operator swallowed hard. Another gust swept the ridge, and this time it carried a new sound. A whistle, far away, then another, then two more in different directions. Signals, coordinated. Andrews felt the hair on his neck rise. Positions, now. The men reshaped the perimeter, tightening the line into a narrow arc along the crest. Every rifle pointed outward. Every Marine leaned forward, eyes straining through swirling snow. The cold bit deeper, pushing into bones now, making fingers clumsy and breath painful. A sudden flare lit the night, not overhead, but far down the valley. A pale orange glow that flickered against the mountainside. Then another, and another. The Chinese were lighting fires, not for warmth, for visibility, for signaling. The flares cast long shadows across the frozen terrain, revealing something Andrews had feared from the start. Movement in the thousands. Dark shapes advancing slowly, methodically, stepping through snow with the calm, tireless pace of men certain of victory. Connolly's voice cracked. "Sir, there's too many." "I know," Andrews replied quietly. "But they're not charging. They're tightening the circle." The men braced as the silhouettes fanned out along multiple ridges, cutting off routes, encroaching inch by inch. The enemy wasn't rushing. They didn't have to. They had the numbers. They had the night. They had the cold. The perimeter shrank without a single shot fired. Dawson whispered, "Sir, they're choking us, 1 inch at a time." Andrews nodded slowly, realizing the truth settling like frost on his spine. The Chinese didn't intend to overrun them with one massive assault. They intended to squeeze them until the cold, exhaustion, and fear did the work for them. Connolly adjusted his scarf with trembling hands. What do we do? Andrews looked over the freezing ridge, at the exhausted men, the failing weapons, the black horizon filled with gathering shadows. We hold, he said. They want us to panic. They want us to break. So we don't. He scanned the encroaching darkness one more time. Tonight isn't the attack, he murmured. Tonight is the setup. And when the real attack came, he knew it would hit with a force the ridge had never felt before. By dawn, the temperature had dropped so low the air felt sharp enough to cut skin. Frost coated every surface, rifles, helmets, packs, turning the ridge into a graveyard of frozen steel. The men of the 31st RCT looked less like soldiers and more like figures carved from ice, stiff, pale, and wrapped in layers that barely slowed the cold gnawing at their bones. Andrews moved through the line, boots crunching over snow hardened overnight. Check your fingers and toes, he ordered softly. If you can't feel them, tell someone. Most men already knew the signs: numbness, stiffness, the creeping fade of sensation. But this morning felt different. This wasn't cold. This was something hostile. Dawson held up his machine gun. The metal was fused with frost. Sir, I can't get the bolt to move at all. Under your coat, Andrews said. Warm it. Use body heat, whatever you can. If I put this thing under my coat, I'll freeze faster. Andrews met his eyes. You freeze either way, but we need that gun. Dawson nodded reluctantly. A shout came from the far right flank. Sir, you need to see this. Andrews hurried over, slipping once on a patch of ice. Connolly and two others were crouched behind a snow berm pointing across the valley. At first, Andrews didn't see anything. Then the wind shifted, and the landscape changed. Dozens of small, dark shapes dotted the snowfields below. Packs, bedrolls, rifles, abandoned in neat, efficient lines. Their gear, Connolly whispered. They left it. Andrews felt the cold twist deeper in his stomach. They dropped weight. They're moving fast now. Marines exchanged uneasy looks. The Chinese were already infamous for winter mobility, traveling light, enduring cold with a discipline Americans struggled to match. But seeing the proof laid bare across the valley hammered the point home. The enemy wasn't weakened by the night. They were emboldened by it. The radio operator slogged up the slope through waist-deep snow. Sir, I got a partial transmission. Andrews grabbed the handset. HQ, this is 31st RCT. We are heavily engaged and surrounded, requesting immediate guidance. The line crackled violently, then steadied. Multiple enemy divisions. Movement confirmed. Do not withdraw. Hold positions. The rest dissolved into static. Connolly's voice shook. Did he say divisions? As in more than one? Andrews lowered the radio slowly. Yes. The men fell silent. The valley felt smaller. The ridge felt thinner. A sudden gust carried the sound again, the same rhythmic crunch they'd heard the night before, but this time it was closer, much closer. Measured, steady footsteps pressing through snow in perfect unison. Dawson swallowed hard. Sir, they're tightening the circle again. Andrews scanned the ridgelines. Shadows shifted between the pines, not rushing, not hiding, just moving into place, calmly, methodically. The Chinese were closing the trap one quiet footstep at a time. Ammo count, Andrews ordered. The replies were grim. 1 magazine. Half. 3 rounds. Bayonet only, sir. Dawson clutched his frozen machine gun. I don't know if she'll fire when they hit us. Connolly's breath shook through chattering teeth. Sir, are we going to be able to break out if they fully encircle us? Andrews didn't answer immediately. He looked out across the valley, at the abandoned gear marking the enemy's trail, at the dark shapes repositioning, at the mountains beyond that seemed to watch silently. Breaking out, he said finally, won't be the hard part. What's the hard part? Connolly asked. Surviving until we even get the chance. Another gust swept across the ridge, colder, harsher, carrying with it a low murmur from the southern slope. The enemy was assembling again. The cold wasn't just draining them now, it was isolating them, weakening weapons, numbing thought, slowing movement. And the Chinese were using it like another form of attack, silent, invisible, relentless. Andrews straightened, voice firm despite the frost forming in his brows. Stay ready. They're close, too close. Because the cold was no longer the background of this battle. It was now part of the enemy's strategy. The attack began without a sound. No whistle, no flare, no warning. One moment the ridge sat in bitter stillness. The next it trembled under the weight of movement, fast, coordinated, everywhere at once. Shadows burst from the tree line below, silhouettes driving forward through waist-deep snow with terrifying speed. Contact front, Dawson yelled, wrenching his machine gun into position. The bolt resisted, frozen stiff, until he slammed it with both fists. Ice cracked loose. The gun jerked forward. He squeezed the trigger. A choked burst sputtered out. 3 rounds, maybe 4. Then the gun died again. Clear it! Andrews shouted, firing short bursts downhill. His rounds vanished into the blur of silhouettes climbing upward. The Chinese charge wasn't wild, it was organized. Teams advanced in staggered lines, using the terrain with practiced ease, slipping behind rocks and frozen shrubs, appearing and disappearing like ghosts drifting through the snow. Connolly fired a burst, then ducked as return fire sliced across the ridge. Snow exploded around him, fine powder spraying into his face like shards of glass. They're pushing both flanks, he shouted. They're pushing every flank, Andrews replied. The ridge shook under the pressure as fire erupted from all directions. Mortar rounds thudded somewhere behind the American line, not directly on them, but close enough to scatter their defenses. Each blast sent up plumes of snow that drifted back down like ash. Andrews crawled along the crest, checking positions. Stay tight, don't let them split us. But the enemy wasn't trying to split the line. They were trying to collapse it. 3 silhouettes appeared on the right side, climbing fast. Connolly pivoted, firing until his rifle clicked empty. I'm out, he yelled, fumbling for another magazine but finding none. Here! A Marine tossed him his last one. Make it count. More shadows pressed up the center. Andrews fired, each round measured, controlled. But even as some attackers fell back, more replaced them. The cold didn't slow the Chinese. It empowered them. Their mobility was unreal, a blur of dark coats against the snow. Dawson finally broke the ice in his weapon and pulled the trigger again. The machine gun roared to life, sweeping across the slope in a short, savage burst. Several silhouettes dropped. The advance wavered, but only for seconds. A burst of fire hit the ridge from the opposite side. The Chinese had circled halfway around, squeezing from behind. The Americans turned, firing into the dark woods as shadows flickered between trees. They're surrounding us, Connolly shouted. We already knew that, Dawson yelled back. A grenade landed near the command post, rolling to a stop beside Andrews. He scooped it and hurled it downhill. The muffled blast shook snow loose from the trees. The perimeter tightened again, not by choice, but by necessity. The line shrank from a broad arc into a small, desperate ring at the crest. Marines fought from every angle, boots slipping in slush, hands numb, rifles hardening with ice. The enemy pushed closer, 10 yards, 7, 5. One silhouette lunged toward the left side. A Marine knocked him back with the butt of his rifle. Another shape burst from the right. Andrews shot twice, dropping him before he reached the crest. The ridge was no longer a battlefield. It was a frozen circle of survival. Then, far in the distance, the faint rumble of engines vibrated through the frozen air. Andrews froze. Not trucks, not tanks, aircraft. He grabbed the radio operator. "Try again! Get them to mark our position!" The operator twisted the dial, fingers shaking. If any air units can hear us, we are under full assault. Request immediate." Static swallowed him. Then a faint voice emerged. "Copy. Hold position. Approaching from the west." Hope didn't erupt. It flickered, fragile, almost afraid to exist. Connolly exhaled a cloud of white. "Sir, is that real?" Andrews watched the sky, listened. The rumble grew louder. "Yes," he said quietly, "but we have to survive until they get here." A new wave of silhouettes surged uphill, faster, closer, determined to break through before air support arrived. "Everyone hold!" Andrews roared. Weapons fired, snow exploded, shadows closed in. The trap had fully sprung, the ridge was moments from collapse, and their only hope was somewhere above the frozen clouds. The roar in the sky grew louder, a deep beating thunder that didn't belong to the mountains or the frozen wind. Marines lifted their heads despite the incoming fire, eyes widening with something dangerously close to hope. Aircraft, American aircraft, cutting through the icy clouds like salvation. But hope was fragile on Chosin, and the Chinese knew it. As soon as the engines echoed across the valley, the enemy intensified their attack. More silhouettes pushed up the slopes in furious, coordinated bursts. They weren't trying to overrun the ridge anymore. They were trying to shatter it before air support arrived. "Hold them!" Andrews shouted. "Just hold!" A squad of Chinese soldiers burst from a snowdrift on the right flank. Connolly fired his last rounds, dropping 2 before his weapon froze solid. Dawson dragged him backward, spraying a short burst from the half-working machine gun. The bolt jammed again. "I'm empty!" a Marine yelled. "So am I!" another answered. Andrews scanned the line. Their ammunition was nearly gone. Their weapons were failing. Their perimeter had shrunk from a ridge defense into a tight, desperate cluster of men standing in knee-deep snow, fighting in every direction. The radio crackled. "Air units inbound. Stand by for strike." "Tell them to hit the lower slopes," Andrews barked. But the radio sputtered, distorted by interference and cold. The men heard the aircraft before they saw them, a pair of distant silhouettes cutting across the gray sky. Then, breaking through the clouds, 2 fighter bombers dove low toward the reservoir. "Get down!" Andrews ordered. The aircraft unleashed a barrage far down the valley, a rolling wave of explosions that tore through the forest floor and erupted in the bright flashes. Snow plumes rose like white geysers. The Chinese on the lower ridges scattered, breaking formation. But it wasn't enough. The pilots couldn't see the ridge through the cloud cover. Their strikes hit the valley, not the enemy closing in on the crest. "They're missing us!" Dawson shouted. "They're buying us time," Andrews countered, "and time is what we need." Another wave of silhouettes pressed uphill, using the noise from the airstrikes as cover. The Marines met them with whatever they had left, single rounds, bayonets, fists gripping frozen rifle stocks. The line quivered. Snow churned under boots. The ridge groaned under the weight of collapse. Then Andrews saw it, a narrow gap on the western slope where fewer enemy troops were gathering, a weakness, the only one they'd seen in hours. He grabbed Dawson's shoulder. "Form on me, we're breaking out." Dawson stared at him. "Sir, with what? Half the men can barely stand." "With each other," Andrews said, "and with what's left." Rourke, breathing hard, nodded. "Better than dying in a circle." Andrews lifted his voice over the chaos. "Everyone fall back to the western side. Move now." The Marines shifted as a unit, stumbling, sliding, pulling one another through waist-deep snow as they poured toward the narrow channel. The Chinese spotted the movement immediately. Gunfire cracked from the flanks. Bullets snapped through branches. The darkness flared with sudden muzzle flashes. "Cover the retreat," Andrews shouted. Dawson forced the machine gun into action again, firing a ragged burst that kept the enemy's heads down just long enough for the platoon to break through the line. The men slid, crawled, and shoved their way down the western slope. Snow tore at their clothes. The cold bit deep, but the path was open, barely. "Keep moving," Andrews ordered. "Don't stop for anything." Connolly tripped, fell forward, and was hauled up instantly by two Marines who refused to leave him. The ridge behind them exploded with more small arms fire as the Chinese realized the breakout was underway and surged forward to close the gap. An explosion rocked the ground. Snow sprayed into the air. The men staggered. "Faster!" Andrews shouted, voice raw. "We're almost through!" The aircraft returned overhead, this time flying lower, closer, engines screaming through the mountain pass. Andrews felt the rumble vibrate through his ribs. Salvation wasn't here yet, but the path to it had finally opened. The breakout had begun, and whether it saved them or destroyed them depended on the next few minutes of pure, brutal will. The western slope dropped steeply into a narrow ravine, a twisting cut of ice and rock barely wide enough for single-file movement. The men stumbled into it like survivors pulled from a sinking ship, breath burning in their throats, legs shaking beneath layers of frost. Behind them, the ridge they had defended for days roared with gunfire as the Chinese swarmed over its crest. Connolly glanced back once, eyes wide. "Sir, they're taking the ridge." "They can have the ridge," Andrews said. "They can't have us." The column pushed deeper into the ravine. Snow reached their thighs now, each step a battle against the cold, dragging at their boots like hands from below. Those who stumbled were lifted by the men beside them. No one walked alone. The wind here was different, a long, hollow whistle echoing between the canyon walls. It sounded like voices, like warnings, like the mountain itself whispering the truth none of them wanted to hear. This road was not meant to be survived. A burst of rifle fire cracked from above. A shadow moved along the cliffside. "Ambush!" someone yelled. Shots rained down, pinging off rocks, slicing through the snow where the column had just been. The Marines dove behind boulders, hugging frozen stone for cover. Andrews raised his pistol and fired upward, his breath crystallizing instantly around the muzzle. "There's too many," Dawson shouted. "They're all over the ridge." The Chinese had anticipated a breakout. Of course they had. They weren't just good at surrounding an enemy. They were masters at choking every possible escape. And now, high above on both sides of the ravine, silhouettes moved with chilling control, firing short bursts before melting back into the snowy crags. "Smoke!" Andrews shouted. A Marine pulled the pin on a smoke grenade and tossed it upward. Thick white clouds blended into the already blinded air, giving the men a thin, precious veil. Not perfect, not safe, but something. "Move," Andrews barked. The column surged forward again, half running, half sliding. The ravine dipped sharply, opening into a narrow frozen riverbed that stretched westward. The ice cracked beneath their boots, groaning like something ancient and angry. Dawson slipped and slammed to the ground. His machine gun skittered across the ice. Connolly grabbed him. "Get up! Get up!" "I'm fine," Dawson gasped, pulling himself upright. But when he reached for the gun, Andrews shook his head. "Leave it. We can't carry what slows us down." Dawson hesitated. That weapon had held their line together for days, but he nodded. "Then I use this," he said, holding up his frost-covered rifle like a club. The riverbed curved sharply, offering brief cover from the high ridges. The men slowed only long enough to catch the faint sound of engines in the distance. Andrews froze. Aircraft. Again, closer this time. "Everyone mark your position," he shouted. Flashes of movement followed, men waving cloths, helmets, anything reflective enough to be seen in the faint daylight. The ravine was narrow, but from above, maybe, just maybe. A fighter roared overhead, then another. Snow blasted off the cliffside from the force of their engines. The aircraft pulled hard, banking around for another pass. The men crouched, bracing themselves. Then the valley behind them erupted. A line of explosions tore across the ridge they'd escaped from, not near them, but directly into the forming Chinese pursuit. Flames and smoke billowed upward, carving a temporary barrier between the Marines and the encircling forces. Connolly exhaled a trembling breath. They hit them. They actually hit them. "We're not safe," Andrews said, "but we're not done either." The column pushed onward, wading through drifts so deep they swallowed knees, stumbling over hidden rocks, carrying wounded men whose feet had gone black with frostbite. The cold was no longer an enemy. It was a predator stalking them, waiting for the moment they slowed. Dawson's teeth chattered uncontrollably. "Sir, how far do we have to go?" "Far enough to live," Andrews answered, "and not one step less." Behind them, gunfire echoed again, distant but closing. The pursuit hadn't broken. It had only paused. The ravine opened into a wide basin of snow and shattered trees, the next stretch of their brutal march. The breakout had begun, but the road ahead was longer, colder, and deadlier than anything they had survived so far, and the shadows in the snow were still moving. The basin stretched before them like a frozen desert, flat, white, and radiating a cold that seemed to rise from beneath the earth itself. The wind had teeth now, sharp and merciless, carving into exposed skin and freezing sweat before it could fall. The men of the 31st RCT marched in a staggered line, bent forward, leaning on rifles like walking sticks. They weren't just fighting the enemy anymore. They were fighting time, fighting the cold, fighting their own bodies. Andrews moved at the front, scanning the distant tree line for movement. Frost clung to his eyebrows, his lashes, the edges of his parka. Each breath felt like it scraped his lungs, but he kept going, because stopping wasn't an option. Connolly limped beside him, dragging one foot through the snow. Andrews looked down. The boot was split, the toe blackened. Frostbite was creeping fast. "Can you walk?" Andrews asked. Connolly nodded once. "Sir, if I stop, I won't start again." Behind them, Dawson carried a Marine whose legs had stopped responding entirely. Others supported wounded men, arms slung over shoulders. No one complained. No one surrendered to the cold. But the fatigue was visible. The slow stumble of boots, the bowed heads, the trembling hands. A distant crack echoed across the basin, then another. Andrews stiffened. "Down!" The men dropped instinctively as bullets snapped overhead, kicking up snowbursts around them. Chinese scouts had positioned themselves on the surrounding ridges, firing from a distance to slow the breakout. Dawson growled through chattering teeth. "They're trying to pin us out here, make the cold kill us for them." He wasn't wrong. The enemy didn't need to close in, not yet. The cold would do the work if the Marines stayed exposed long enough. Andrews signaled, and the column crawled to the cover of a fallen tree line. The logs were frozen solid, coated in wind-driven snow, but they provided just enough concealment to regroup. The radio operator approached, frost forming on his mask. "Sir, I got another transmission, faint but clear enough." Andrews took the handset. "Units withdrawing south, Marines forming defensive line. If you can reach Hagaru-ri, repeat, reach Hagaru-ri." Hagaru-ri, a lifeline. A fortified Marine position miles away, but reachable, barely. Connolly exhaled, relief and fear mixing in one breath. "Sir, that's days of marching." "Then we march," Andrews said, "because there's no other choice." As the column prepared to move again, the wind shifted, carrying the unmistakable sound of skis cutting through snow. Andrews froze. "Ski troops," he whispered, "flanking us." Out of the tree line to the north, dark shapes glided into view. Chinese skiers, moving fast, weaving between drifts with unsettling grace. They weren't attacking yet. They were tracking, shadowing the column, waiting for the perfect point to strike. "They're hurting us," Dawson muttered. "Just like last night." "No," Andrews replied. "Tonight they finish what they started." The Marines pushed on, their pace quickening despite the exhaustion weighing on every step. Ice cracked underfoot. Snow blinded them with sudden gusts. The sun dipped lower, throwing long blue shadows across the basin. The temperature dropped again, sharply enough that even their breath felt brittle. A Marine stumbled and fell. Another followed. Andrews rushed over. "Get up! Come on, you have to stand." But their legs refused. Frostbite had taken too much. The cold had drained whatever strength they had left. "We can't leave them," Connolly said, voice breaking. "We won't," Andrews answered, "but someone has to carry them." Two Marines hoisted one man up. Dawson lifted the other, grunting through clenched teeth. The column moved again, slower now, burdened by weight and exhaustion. The ski troops shadowed them from the distance, silhouettes gliding just close enough to remind them the trap wasn't broken. Not yet. Ahead, the basin narrowed into another ravine, one darker, narrower, and somehow even colder. Andrews stared into it, knowing the truth. This next stretch would break someone, maybe several someones, maybe the entire column. But there was no turning back. "Stay tight," he whispered. "Stay moving." Because in the Chosin Reservoir, stopping was dying, and the night was coming again. The final ravine felt like the frozen throat of the earth, narrow, twisting, and filled with a cold so deep it hummed through bone. Night pressed in fast, swallowing the weak blue light as the men of the 31st RCT pushed forward, bent under exhaustion, dragging wounded men whose legs no longer obeyed them. Andrews led the column, leaning into the wind, each step a decision to stay alive. Behind him, Connolly limped with a boot split open from frostbite, while Dawson supported a Marine whose feet had turned stiff as wood. Ponchos stiff with ice were used as makeshift sleds, pulled by men who could barely lift their arms. Above them, dark silhouettes moved along the ridge, Chinese ski troops pacing the march like wolves tracking prey. They weren't firing. They were waiting for the perfect moment. The ravine walls narrowed, shadows thickened. Andrews felt the trap tightening again. Then a glint flashed from the cliff. "Down!" he shouted. Gunfire erupted from both sides. Bullets snapped through the air, punching into snow and stone. Marines dove behind frozen rocks, pulling wounded men with them. Dawson fired upward, his rounds disappearing into darkness but buying seconds. "They're bracketing us," Connolly yelled. "We can't stay in here." Smoke was their only chance. "Pop smoke!" Andrews ordered. White smoke rolled through the ravine, blending with fog and snow until visibility dropped to nothing. It was chaos, men stumbling blind, dragging each other, slipping on ice. But the enemy fire faltered, unable to see their targets. "Move!" Andrews roared. The column surged forward, half running, half sliding around a bend that broke the enemy's line of fire. For a moment, silence returned. Heavy, cold, almost unreal. Then Andrews heard it. Engines, multiple engines. The sound grew louder, echoing through the ravine like a rising heartbeat. Connolly blinked through frost. "Sir, is that us?" "God, I hope so," Dawson muttered. Through swirling snow, headlights appeared. 4 Marine Corps trucks flanked by half-tracks barreling toward them. Their engines roared against the cold, cutting through the night like rescue made real. "31st RCT?" a Marine shouted from the lead truck. "Get in, move!" The survivors didn't cheer. They didn't have the strength. They simply moved, dragging the wounded, lifting frostbitten men into the beds of the trucks, collapsing into metal walls that burned their skin with cold. Dawson nearly fell off the tailgate until Connolly yanked him inside. Andrews helped the last two men aboard before climbing in himself. Chinese gunfire cracked from the cliffs, a final desperate attempt to crush them, but the trucks were already accelerating. Bullets pinged off armor, vanished into snow, and faded behind them as the convoy tore south toward Hagaruri. The cold chased them, but it couldn't keep up. Hours later, the faint lights of the marine perimeter flickered through the storm. The wounded stirred. The frostbitten blinked awake. Connolly leaned against the truck bed, voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, we actually made it." Andrews looked at the men lying beside him, frozen, exhausted, half-conscious, but alive. "No," he said softly. "We didn't make it." Connolly frowned. "Then what did we do?" "We refused to die," Andrews answered. "That's why we're here." And as the convoy rolled into safety, one truth settled over every man. The mountains tried to crush them. The cold tried to claim them. The enemy tried to surround and break them. But Task Force Faith walked through the frozen jaws of hell and finished the march no winter in history could ever stop.